This week we're going to be looking at two distinct theories that ask us to, in some way, rethink and criticize the tradition of epistemology, the views of epistemology that we've encountered so far, and they want to call into question some of the assumptions that underlie the tradition of epistemology that we looked at, as these are found in all the different forms of rationalism, empiricism, the skeptical tradition, and so on. So these are traditions, pragmatism and feminism, that both arose in the 20th century. Pragmatism in the early part of the 20th century, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and feminism has really grown to prominence in the period in the last 50 years or so in particular. Both of them ways of rethinking the idea of knowledge. Now let's start with pragmatism, and what's very important to stress about pragmatism is that it wants us to be aware of the link between our thoughts and our actions. And pragmatism wants to argue that the meaning of our concepts and theories must be understood in terms of the practical effects associated with them. Okay, so when we understand what it is to have a claim to knowledge, to have a, more elaborately of course, to have a theory about the world, and we can understand the theory as a whole set of knowledge claims, a whole set of knowledge claims within it. For example, if we sort of say, well, we have a theory that the world is spherical. Within that theory there will be a whole series of knowledge claims associated with it. For example, we would expect that if you started walking or traveling at one point of the earth and kept going in the same direction, you would eventually come back to your starting point. So here's what would be a knowledge claim. Let's say the earth is spherical. The earth is not flat, it's spherical. Now, the practical effect associated with that is about what effects on our behavior, what changes that makes in how we do things, or how we perceive, how we think about encountering different problems and perplexities that we face. So wherever there's a claim to know something, we have to look at it in terms of, for the pragmatist, in terms of its potential practical effects. The truth of our beliefs, pragmatists claim, their claim to knowledge, is understood as the success of certain beliefs in enabling us to do things. And that's really characteristic for pragmatism, and it's often seen as one of the most controversial things about their whole idea of knowledge, that the truth of a belief is identified with its success in enabling us to do things. So, for example, to use our same example again, the truth of the belief that the earth is in fact spherical, the truth of that belief depends upon its success in enabling us to do things and predict certain things. For example, to travel around the world. For example, to make sense of weather patterns, and to make sense of sort of other experiences that we have. So that claim about the earth is one that enables us to successfully do certain other things. And for pragmatists, that's key to what it means to claim that something is true. So, very important for pragmatism, we have to understand knowledge as a whole, and this is something very different from the tradition, from all of the other theories that we've looked at. We have to understand knowledge as a whole in terms of its role within practice. It's not something that somehow stands separated from our lives and how we do things. It's part of our way of interacting with the world. It's inseparable from our way of trying to successfully negotiate our way around the world. It's an essential practical tool, pragmatists will often say, that knowledge is a practical tool to enable us to get things done. So to understand what the pragmatists are saying, we need to appreciate their claim that knowledge is part of our general need to deal with problems and issues arising in our experience. So, knowing is not simply a detached attitude of contemplation. It is a way of interacting with the world. In saying that knowing is not a detached attitude of contemplation, again, the point here is that knowing is something that we do in order to be able to negotiate our way around the world successfully, in order to be able to accomplish tasks that are pressing tasks for us as human beings. So there's no, there's no activity called knowing that is separate from all of the other things that we do as humans. In fact, it's something that helps us to do all of those other things. It's one of our primary ways of interacting with the world. In saying that it's a way of interacting with the world, pragmatists want us to stop thinking about knowledge as, again, this sort of detached attitude of looking at the world, as though we were separate from it and just making claims to know it, making claims to know things about it. Pragmatists want to say that that's a very misleading view of what knowing is. Knowing is really about trying to be more successful at finding our ways around the world. And pragmatists are very much taken by the idea of sort of forming hypotheses and testing them out and changing things that don't work. It's very much a sort of a scientific view of sort of changing our knowledge to fit what works and what doesn't work, changing our knowledge according to what the circumstances dictate. So that's really part of the thing that's driving the pragmatist view of knowledge, and that's why they see it as a way of interacting with the world, a way of trying to solve problems that arise in our experience. Now we can look at this more simply if we focus on the pragmatic value of beliefs in general. And for pragmatists, we could do this with, they would argue we could do this for any belief that we happen to hold. If we look at a number of examples of how this might work, the dog is dangerous. What is the pragmatic value of that belief? If, say, it's a claim to know something, to know that here is a dangerous dog. Well, obviously it alters our behavior in certain ways. If we make this claim, it means that we would expect certain things to happen. We would expect if, for example, we approached the dog in a certain way, we would expect a certain response. It even cautions us not to do certain things, perhaps not to get too close, not to approach, not to look the dog in the eye, etc. So the belief itself is defined by what it sets out for us in terms of possible behaviors, and the way it suggests for us that other kinds of behaviors, approaching the dog very, very quickly and aggressively, won't be successful. It suggests that if we want to negotiate our way around this experience, we have to approach it in a certain way. So you can see that the belief itself has a certain practical value. It directs us towards certain practical effects. And the same would be true in case of the belief that the glass is fragile. If that's true, we may be more inclined to hold it in a certain way, to not put it on certain surfaces. Again, it's the way that belief has certain practical effects for us. It changes the way that we interact with this object. If we think of it as a hypothesis, it would suggest that, again, if we're going to be sort of successful in our encounters with this glass, we have to treat it a certain way. We have to approach it in a certain way, and we have to do certain things in relation to it, not grasp it too tightly, for example. So, again, it's about the practical consequences of believing something. That's what pragmatism is really interested in. If you believe that fire needs oxygen in order to burn, commonly and universally accepted assumption. But think again about how if you propose that belief, and let's suppose that you're the first person to discover that fire actually needs oxygen in order to burn. If you propose that belief, think about how it might change your practice, how it might have practical effects. Think about how it would change how you, as it of course did change, how you treat certain fires, how you approach them, how you try to deal with them, as opposed to if the assumption didn't hold. So again, it's a belief with certain practical effects. Let's consider finally the belief, the example we looked at in a previous lecture. Let's suppose that the belief is, I believe today is Brenda's birthday. Okay. Now, again, this is a good example because it shows us that pragmatists don't want to look at claims to knowledge in abstraction from the role that they play in forms of practice, in our abilities to successfully do things and to negotiate our way around the world. According to pragmatists, again, if we look at the pragmatic value of the belief here, think about the kinds of behaviors that would be prompted by that belief. Perhaps I should go and buy Brenda a card. Perhaps I should call her up and wish her a happy birthday. The belief is not simply some sort of detached claim that has its own, its own justification in itself. The claim here, the belief, say that I believe it's true that today is Brenda's birthday, that leads me on to a whole series of behaviors. Now, if for example, say I phone Brenda up and say today is your birthday, and she's completely bemused and say, well, actually it was last month. Obviously, here's a case where pragmatists would say that belief is not successful. That belief did not succeed. Okay? If I phone Brenda up and she's very excited and very happy that I've called and so on, here's a case where we have a successful belief. It has guided us towards behaviors that have had their intended effect. So I think there's a lot of sense in the pragmatist idea that we can always look at beliefs in terms of their pragmatic value. Just one issue that we need to deal with in looking at pragmatism and the pragmatic idea of beliefs and the pragmatic idea of truth, we always have to ask, and it's the most common criticism against pragmatists, well, that may be true, but does it mean that truth is reducible to practical effects? Does it mean that all there is to truth is its successful, its ability to contribute successfully to certain subsequent actions and behaviors? So that's something we'll bear in mind. Now, a very famous pragmatist and one of perhaps even the most celebrated American philosopher, John Dewey, used a couple of terms that we're going to look at here which clarify some important aspects about pragmatism. And the first is his idea of instrumentalism. What Dewey means when he talks about instrumentalism is, as the term suggests, that our beliefs about the world are like instruments for dealing with situations that we face in life. Think of tools that we use. We use a hammer or a pair of pliers to enable us to deal with certain situations. Right? If we need to construct a sturdy set of shelves or whatever, we'll probably employ a hammer to enable us to deal with that situation. Now, for Dewey, beliefs have something in similar with instruments, and tools, of course, are a form of instrument. Beliefs have something in common with instruments in that they are responses to experience. They respond to the demands of our life situation, right? And we can understand a hammer, for example, as responding to a particular need in a life situation, whether that's that there's a shelf that's rocky, that's not stable, and it needs to be hammered into place. So we use a hammer to respond to the needs of that situation. Similarly, Dewey says we can think of beliefs a little bit like that too. That what matters in beliefs is how they enable us to negotiate situations, how they enable us to do more, to find our way around the world more successfully. This had a particular application in Dewey's work on education, and he sort of had a very original and very influential view of education that revolutionized American education and education across the world as well, through a broader influence of his theories. And his view of sort of successful practices in education was very much sort of on the instrumentalist model that Dewey felt, we need a theory of education that really that enables us to get to a certain situation where children are actually learning things, that the education is sort of successful. And he argued that the assumptions behind his theory would be judged according to how they nurtured children who were able to think more clearly and critically than any other view of education. So it's how the theories enable us to respond, to negotiate life successfully. That's really what's important in thinking about pragmatism. And that's what Dewey's instrumentalism is trying to direct us towards. Now, instead of speaking of truth, Dewey uses this idea of what's called warranted assertability. And this term is supposed to capture the success of beliefs that best fit with our experience, and which seem best suited to guide future inquiry. So the idea is that, and it's a bit of a it's a very sort of long-winded phrase, but instead of calling something true, Dewey suggests that we call something assertively warranted, or warranted in its assertability, meaning that it successfully captures, it successfully fits with our experience. It enables us to do things that we couldn't do before. And it looks like the kind of belief that sets us on new and novel paths of inquiry in the future. Peirce was another pragmatist, Charles Sanders Peirce. To understand what our concepts mean, he argues, we have to look at the way they interact with the world. We have to see how they work in practice. One of Peirce's most famous ideas was the idea of the sort of open communication community. And he argued that open scientific inquiry would eventually lead to a closer approximation of our beliefs to the truth. In other words, there's a sort of, we never actually get to the stage where we can say perhaps that something is finally and definitively true. However, he was a big believer in the openness of inquiry, in enabling different points of view and beliefs to sort of come together and to try to describe things from their perspective, and eventually the most successful beliefs, the ones that better enabled us to solve whatever problems they were trying to solve, would eventually be the ones that would win out. So for Peirce, it was open inquiry that led us closer towards coming towards a view of the world, a theory of knowledge that would be closer to the truth, that would eventually approximate to the truth. James is perhaps the most well-known of pragmatists, and also a famous popularizer of pragmatism. His works are widely read outside of philosophy. One of James's mostly well-known quotes is when he asks, what, in short, is the belief's cash value in experiential terms? And that, for James, is the central question of pragmatism. In other words, to understand a belief, again, when James talks about cash value, what he means is, how does it change how we do things? What does it enable us to do that we couldn't do before? So, again, you can see that the model here is on sort of scientific inquiry and making instrumental change through scientific inquiry. When we come up with a new belief, what we're really interested in, if we want to say, well, is this really knowledge, or doesn't it tell us anything about the world? What is the truth value of this belief? What does it tell us about the world? According to James and the other pragmatists, that question is inseparable from asking after a belief's cash value. In other words, if we want to know is it true, we have to ask, well, what does it enable us to do? How does it change the way we're able to do things? How does it deepen our ability to interact successfully with the world? Another quote that James gives us, which I think again expresses his view very nicely, he says, the true is the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. Now by saying the expedient, James is talking about the fact of its being something that helps us, that is useful for us. So that concept of usefulness, of aiding us and enabling us to do something successfully, as I've been saying, is very important for pragmatism. Now this, a lot of people would definitely have reservations about the comparison here, a lot of non-pragmatists, about the comparison with the right, or James is really talking about moral thinking, saying that, you know, our moral terms, when we call something good or bad or right or wrong, all that we're talking about is what is useful to us in the sphere of behavior. And he's saying that the true is the useful in the sphere of thinking, just as the right or the good or whatever is useful to us in the sphere of behavior. And of course some people would say, well, that's not all there is to true. It may be the case that when we have a belief and it's true, it will enable us to do things. However, that's not all there is to a belief being true. Similarly, some people would say it may be that it's better for us to behave well, to behave morally, to be good, than to behave badly, that it's better for us as a society if everybody obeys the rules and obeys the rules of right conduct. However, the fact of it being expedient, of it being useful, isn't what makes it right. Similarly, the fact of its being expedient isn't what makes a belief true. So it's a controversial phrase, but it does suggest something about the very different perspective on knowledge that pragmatism. Let's finish by looking at a couple of problems for pragmatism, or issues that we can raise about pragmatism. The first we can ask, is the idea of a belief being useful really the same thing as its being true? I've raised this in a couple of places as we've gone along, and I think it's crucial for any discussion of pragmatism to think about this question. It may be that something is useful, but does that mean that being true is the same thing as being useful? You know, many people would argue that many of our beliefs that happen to be true, in fact, are not useful at all, but stop us from doing things. That sometimes, you know, finding something to be true is a matter of something that impedes our ability to usefully do things. Think about, you know, for example, a scenario where a person finds out that they have a particular illness or disease that stops them being able to do certain things. It may be true that the person has the disease. However, the belief in its being true would of course impede other things and sort of stop them doing certain types of activities and so on. Now of course James another pragmatist would say, well, but on the other hand, knowing that one has the disease also will enable you to negotiate your condition more successfully. And that's true as well. So it's really about how you see knowledge here, and whether you think that there is some value to knowledge, that there is a perspective that exceeds simply usefulness. Another thing we can ask is, are pragmatists really at bottom skeptics? In other words, do they deny that we can ever know that a belief is really true or false? Well, in a sense, it's true that pragmatists do say and are committed to saying that, you know, it's a perpetual process of correction, that you know, we can say that our belief has worked in practice thus far, but of course that's not the same thing as saying it's true or false. However, whether that makes them skeptics depends upon what sort of a sense one holds about what it means for something to be true or false, and how much depth you want to give to the idea of something being true or false. Pragmatists would say, well, there's really nothing behind those concepts other than how successful or unsuccessful we've been with our beliefs, or, you know, in our conduct as a result of the beliefs we have. There's nothing more behind those beliefs other than how successful they've enabled us to be. And it depends on whether, again, you think that, well, whether that's true, or whether there is a perspective that we can say, well, regardless of whether it's useful or not, there is an independent perspective from which we can say that something is definitively true or false. Is there a standpoint we can take outside of our sort of practical interaction with the world that enables us to look at something as true or false? as of course Descartes and the rationalists and other theorists have suggested that it is. Pragmatists deny that, and that's very characteristic of their theory. Now, let's turn our attention to look at feminist epistemology. And it has in common with pragmatism the fact that it, again, wants to criticize assumptions of Western epistemology in particular, and the tradition that we've looked at so far. It wants to criticize some of the standard assumptions, what it takes to be some of the standard assumptions in Western philosophy. So, as a way of getting into the feminist standpoint, let's first distinguish what are the two main varieties of feminism. Liberal feminists. Liberal feminists are those who do not want to criticize the basic structures and assumptions of Western society and its thinking. Instead, they argue that the goal is for women to have full and equal participation in that society. So, for example, a liberal feminist would be less inclined to talk about the distinction between the public and the private in Western society as being a problem. They would argue that what we need to do is to enable women to compete equally in the public sphere, to have equal participation in all areas as with men. So the key is for women to be given the same sort of access. Now, other thinkers, as we'll see, wouldn't take that view, but liberal feminists are. There's a sense to saying that their perspective sees the problem in terms of women's access to the same opportunities. They want full and equal participation, and the problem arises when women are denied that full and equal participation. However, in order to enable that to take place, liberal feminists don't necessarily think that we would have to radically question our views about our society and its standard ways of thinking and categorizing people and sort of its basic forms of social organization. Liberal feminists think that we don't necessarily need to do that, we just need to open the structures and make them more equal. It's often thought to be a colorblind idea of gender justice, that it argues what we need is simply to treat people equally, which is not being done now because of prevailing prejudices, and all that we need to do is remove those barriers and we can have full equality. Gender feminists argue differently. They would suggest that the basic structures of society, and also, and as we'll see, this will be important for the rethinking of epistemology, and also the basic structures of our thinking reflect the assumptions of the history of male domination. Now, what that means is that we're never going to get to an equal society for gender feminists unless we can call into question the basic structures of society and also the basic assumptions behind our thinking, including, of course, our epistemological assumptions. In a sense, gender feminists want the same goal as liberal feminists. They want to get to a condition of sort of equality and full participation. But they argue that we're not going to be able to get there unless we can call into question basic social structures and basic structures of our thoughts. There are two forms of gender feminists. There are essentialists, or rather two sort of variations. Essentialists believe that there is a stable notion of female nature, whether it's the result of biological or sometimes stable cultural factors. In other words, factors that we can't easily change or transform. Non-essentialists deny that gender can be characterized in a fixed way at all, outside of particular forms of social construction. They argue that there's simply nothing to gender outside of the way that a particular society constructs male and female and puts them into certain social roles. So in essence, it's something that could be molded in any way whatsoever. There's nothing stable, there's no sort of biological route that guides it towards certain social forms. So that's a very radical assumption, so that the non-essentialist assumption seems to need further justification than the essentialist assumption. Now let's look at the critique of four key epistemological assumptions in feminist epistemology. The four key assumptions that are talked about in our. And the first one mentioned is called the generic humanity assumption. And the idea here is that human nature, in this assumption, human nature reflects men's experience and excludes women's experiences of the world. In other words, typically when philosophers talk about human nature, and particularly in its role on the sort of our capacity as knowing subjects, as subjects who are in a knowledgeable relation with the world, they argue that theorists embody into that assumption male experiences and exclude women's unique way of experiencing the world. For example, it's often been an assumption in much social thought. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in particular, as we'll see later on in the course, held this assumption, but it's really been a key assumption in much social theory that humans are fundamentally selfish. Now, just whether it's true or not, we may say, well, yes, unfortunately it is true, but it may be the case on the other hand that this is an idea that reflects men's experiences in the world more than it does women's experiences, because of the sort of historical way in which those experiences have sort of been formed in different practices, with sort of women much more tied to the private and men sort of much more associated with the public. So the idea of individuals who selfishly pursue their interests or self-interestedly pursue their interests may be something that reflects a male perspective on the world. Not necessarily, you may disagree with that, but just as an example, it may be that in this way we build into our sort of ideas of human nature, ideas which really reflect the experiences of a certain gender, the male perspective, rather than being, universally human. And that's the generic humanity assumption. Now, the view from nowhere, the second assumption, is the idea that we can look at reality free from any particular point of view, free from any particular cultural background. It's from nowhere because it abstracts, it sort of separates itself out from any particular culture, any particular point of view, and claims to be able to look at the world from a completely detached point of view. Now, some argue that this idea builds into the idea of knowledge, a typically male form of experiencing the world, one which is unengaged and unemotional. And again, the idea is that there's a sort of male way of experiencing the world that's formed through the way that men are socialized, and that includes socialized to look at problems in a very much detached, unengaged, and unemotional sort of way, and that male socialization, the way that men are socialized to do that, is then projected into an assumption of how we know things. In other words, it then is said to underlie the human relation of knowledge to the world. So here's the idea that in working from this assumption of a view from nowhere, we privilege again the male perspective and forget that is one that is formed by the way that men are socialized and is not again a universal human experience. Feminist philosophers also criticize the pure and impersonal nature of our conceptions of reason. Feminist philosophers have often criticized the strict dichotomies that exist in our sort of thinking, and we're aware of a lot of those dichotomies. For example, things like reason and emotion, objective versus subjective, logic versus intuition, etc. And they argue that these sort of dichotomies devalue certain important ways of relating to the world and placing oneself in a cognitive relationship to it. And the idea of a pure impersonal reason that is sort of detached from emotion and engagement is one important part of that. So feminists argue that idea of pure impersonal reason again sort of devalues more feminine ways of taking up a cognitive relationship to the world. By cognitive I mean a knowing relationship to the world. It devalues the ways in which women are more likely to enter into a relationship of knowing and understanding in the world around them. So, by sort of separating reason from emotion and objective from subjective, again, it prioritizes a particularly male way of knowing, of having a knowing relationship with the world. Sarah, excuse me, Sarah Ruddick is a good example of this, in that she argues that mothering, the sort of nurturing relationship with children, embodies its own model of knowledge, involving such traits as caring, intimacy, responsibility, and trust. And in her book, Ruddick argues that these traits in fact amount to a different model of knowledge, a model of knowledge that is completely different from the sort of detached, unemotional idea of knowledge that we're familiar with in the dominant tradition. So here is one where things like caring, intimacy, and so on would be important to a knowing relationship with the world. The fourth assumption is what's called in the book the Robinson Crusoe assumption. And the idea here is to criticize the individualist assumptions behind the traditional account of epistemology. And think here of Descartes in particular, and the idea of the individual who sort of takes a knowing relation to the world in complete abstraction from everybody else and everything else. Descartes sort of, is very solitary and writes his meditations coming to conclusions purely sort of on his own, and is a very isolated sort of view of our knowledge, our epistemological relation to the world. Now, if, as a lot of feminists claim, knowledge is inherently social, there's a very important consequence that follows from that. It means, in fact, that knowledge can be skewed or altered, changed, coloured by the values, ideologies, and power structure in a particular society. What that means is that then when we look at knowledge, we also have to be aware of how our social values, of how the sort of relations of power in the society between dominant groups and other groups, how that can affect our views of knowledge, and how that can affect our perspective of what knowledge is. And for feminists, I think, and that's a very important and insightful part of their critique, when we look at knowledge, we always have to be, or when we look at a view of knowledge in epistemology, we also have to be aware and be careful that we can limit the particular sort of group values or the ideology or the forms of power that are embodied within that epistemology. And feminists argue that, of course, that our traditional sort of disembodied and disengaged and very unemotional view of knowledge is one that has very much been skewed towards a power structure of patriarchy. In other words, it's one that prioritizes the superior role of men in a society. So I think that's an interesting critique, and it's something that gives us a new perspective on epistemology and how to evaluate epistemological theory. So, just final reflections on this week. I think both of these theories, pragmatism and feminism, ask us to really raise the question in a very stark way of what is knowledge for. And they both question our traditional assumptions about knowing as a detached intellectual activity, instead encouraging us to see knowledge as something that is part of practice, something that is not separable from other things that we do in the world, and also something that embodies certain values. It embodies, and it's not separable from a society's structure and perhaps a society's ideology and values, so that we always have to be aware of when we evaluate an epistemology, how much these assumptions are hidden within the epistemology as sort of just parts of its very structure. So just have a think to sum up. Have a think on your own account of which theory you find most persuasive, or which account do you in particular find to be really gels with your intuitions about what epistemology is, or what knowledge is for. Can we contextualize knowledge? And this is an important question that we need to ask subsequently to the things we've looked at this week. Can we contextualize knowledge without giving up the claim of our beliefs to reflect the world as it is? In other words, the more and as pragmatism and feminism encourage us to do, the more that we sort of see our knowledge as inseparable from society and the social context, do we have to give up the idea that our beliefs can somehow independently truly reflect the world as it really is. And a further thing, does that really matter? How important is that claim? Is it misleading to claim that there is a perspective from which our beliefs can somehow independently reflect the world as it is, independently of our values, interests and perspectives and everything else? So I'll leave you to ponder that thought and that idea for the end of this week's lecture.